Between 1914 and 2011, military forces dropped over 26 billion leaflets on enemy positions, broadcast thousands of hours through loudspeakers across frozen trenches and desert sands, and convinced nearly 500,000 soldiers to surrender without firing a shot. At Stalingrad, 91,000 Germans walked into captivity after Soviet broadcasts promised warmth. In the Gulf War, 87,000 Iraqis buried white flags in the sand exactly as American leaflets instructed. At Iwo Jima, out of 21,000 Japanese defenders, 216 surrendered. The difference between those outcomes wasn't the volume of paper dropped or the wattage of speakers. It was understanding who was listening and what would make them stop fighting. This is how psychological warfare evolved from a desperate experiment in a London mansion to the most cost-effective weapon in the modern arsenal, and why 25 billion leaflets over Vietnam failed while 29 million over Iraq succeeded. The scale escalated fast. By July 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, British forces dropped 10 million leaflets on German positions. The themes were simple. Your country is losing. 585,000 total casualties by November. Surrender and live. The British claimed 12,000 Germans walked into their lines because of those leaflets. Whether propaganda caused it or the sheer horror of the Somme, nobody could prove. But the correlation was enough. On the 1st of July, 1917, at Messines Ridge in Belgium, the British detonated mines that killed 19,000 Germans in seconds. Then they did something new. They set up loudspeakers. Massive horns that broadcast surrender instructions across no man's land. The sound of a human voice, amplified and disembodied, telling soldiers their deaths were pointless. Surrenders jumped 20%. By the 20th of September, Canadian forces at Ypres loaded 7,000 artillery shells with leaflets instead of explosives. 300 Germans surrendered. The British were learning a brutal math. Leaflets cost 1 cent each. Bullets cost $1. And if you could get one surrender for every 5,000 leaflets, you were saving money and lives. By the armistice on November 11th, 1918, Britain had dropped 200 million leaflets. They credited those pieces of paper with 38,000 German surrenders. The paper blizzard had proven itself. When America entered the war on April 6th, 1917, President Wilson created the Committee on Public Information under a journalist named George Creel. By summer, Creel's team had prepared 75 million leaflets for the Western Front. They recruited a young advisor named Edward Bernays, who would later become known as the father of public relations. Bernays crafted 4-minute speeches for volunteers to deliver in movie, theaters, churches, anywhere crowds gathered. The speeches urged Americans to buy war bonds and demonize the Germans. Bernays lived to 103 years old, dying in 1995, long enough to see his techniques dominate advertising and politics. In June 1918, at Belleau Wood in France, the U.S. 2nd Division dropped 1 million leaflets on German lines. Promises of humane treatment, hot food, medical care. 1,000 Germans surrendered. The Americans suffered 9,777 casualties taking the wood, but those 1,000 surrenders meant 1,000 fewer rifles shooting back. George Creel filed a report in 1918 that would haunt the century. He wrote that the hysteria produced by propaganda had impressed a young German soldier named Adolf Hitler with the power of psychological warfare. Hitler had been gassed and hospitalized when the armistice came. He blamed Germany's defeat not on military failure, but on the collapse of morale, which he attributed to Allied propaganda. The lesson he took from Creel and Masterman would shape the next war. On August 22, 1939, days before invading Poland, Adolf Hitler told his generals something chilling. I will provide a propagandistic casus belli. Its credibility doesn't matter. The victor will not be asked whether he told the truth. Hitler had studied the British leaflets from the trenches. He understood that propaganda didn't need to be true. It needed to be loud and relentless. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, 3 million troops crossed into the Soviet Union. Within a month, German aircraft had dropped 10 million leaflets on Soviet positions. The messages promised liberation from Stalin, painted the Germans as saviors. The Soviets countered with their own loudspeakers, calling the invaders fascist beasts. Stalin had been preparing for this. Back in 1934, the Soviet Union built the ANT-20, a massive propaganda plane with an onboard cinema and printing press. It crashed in 1935, killing all 34 people aboard, including the crew. But the concept survived. By November 8, 1941, as German Army Group Center approached Moscow, Soviet forces dropped 2 million leaflets on the freezing Wehrmacht soldiers. The winter amplified everything: frostbite, hunger, and then these papers floating down, promising warmth and food if they surrendered. German casualties reached 500,000 by December. The propaganda didn't stop the advance, but it planted seeds of doubt that would bloom at Stalingrad. On January 30th, 1943, 250,000 men of the German Sixth Army were encircled in the ruins of Stalingrad. The temperature hit minus 30 degrees Celsius. Soviet forces set up loudspeakers around the perimeter. The broadcasts were methodical. First, classical music. Beethoven, to remind the Germans of home. Then a voice. Your situation is hopeless. General Paulus has been ordered to fight to the last man, but you don't have to die. Surrender, and you'll receive food, medical care, and repatriation after the war. The Soviets dropped 5 million leaflets into the pocket. Many Germans used them for insulation against the cold, stuffing them into their boots and jackets. But the message seeped in. On February 1st, Paulus radioed Berlin. Sixth Army requests surrender terms. Hitler refused. The next day, Paulus surrendered anyway. 91,000 starving, frostbitten Germans walked into Soviet captivity. It was the largest surrender in military history to that point. Whether the loudspeakers caused it or the impossible conditions, the Soviets didn't care. They had turned the tide of the Eastern Front, and propaganda had played a role. The frozen voices of Stalingrad became legend. The Mediterranean campaigns showed propaganda's uneven power. On November 8, 1942, during Operation Torch, American forces landing in North Africa dropped 250,000 leaflets on Vichy French troops. The message was simple: join the Allies. Your enemy is Germany, not us. The Vichy forces, already demoralized and conflicted about fighting for a German puppet government, capitulated quickly. Allied casualties totaled just 1,346. On July 10, 1943, Operation Husky hit Sicily. American and British planes dropped 13 million leaflets on Italian and German defenders. The Italians were exhausted after 3 years of war. 165,000 Axis troops became casualties or prisoners. By September 3rd, at Salerno on the Italian mainland, Fifth Army leaflets promised no reprisals for surrender. Italy switched sides on September 8th, but the Germans fought on for another year and a half. The contrast was stark. On January 19, 1942, British forces in Singapore set up loudspeakers urging Japanese troops to surrender. The Japanese ignored them completely. When Singapore fell on February 15th, 138,000 British and Indian soldiers became prisoners. The cultural difference was becoming clear. European troops responded to rational arguments about survival. The Japanese operated under a code that made surrender unthinkable. The invasion of Europe saw propaganda reach industrial scale. Before D-Day on June 6, 1944, Allied aircraft dropped 17 million leaflets on the Atlantic Wall. The German defenders numbered 1.2 million troops stretched across France. The leaflets told them the invasion was inevitable, that resistance was futile, that Germany had already lost. American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions carried portable loudspeakers on D-Day itself. As paratroopers landed in the dark, some units broadcast surrender instructions in German. 5,000 Germans died on the first day. How many might have surrendered instead without the propaganda? Nobody knows. On August 15th, Operation Dragoon hit southern France. 20 million leaflets preceded the landings. German Army Group G, already stretched thin, saw 165,000 men become prisoners. Then came the Battle of the Bulge on December 17th. Hitler's last desperate offensive threw 410,000 troops at 84,000 surprised Americans. U.S. loudspeaker teams rushed forward, broadcasting that this was Germany's last gasp, that the war was already over. The psychological campaign couldn't stop the initial German advance, but it prevented the offensive from gaining the momentum Hitler needed. By the war's end, the United States had dropped 1 billion leaflets across all theaters. 6,000 loudspeaker teams had deployed. The paper storm over Europe had become a permanent feature of modern warfare. The Pacific told a different story. On February 19, 1945, Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima. Intelligence knew 21,000 Japanese defenders waited in the volcanic rock. Before the landing, aircraft dropped 500,000 leaflets. Loudspeaker teams set up 300 units around the island as the battle raged. The leaflets promised food, water, medical care, repatriation. They showed photographs of Japanese prisoners being treated well. The loudspeakers broadcast surrender instructions in Japanese, sometimes for hours. Out of 21,000 Japanese soldiers, 216 surrendered. 98% fought to the death. The Marines suffered 26,000 casualties, taking 8 square miles of volcanic ash. One of the few Japanese who did surrender was a medic. He walked out carrying a leaflet, hands raised. American intelligence debriefed him, and he provided detailed information about tunnel networks that saved an estimated 20 lives. On April 1st, Okinawa began. 10 million leaflets, 300 loudspeakers. The Japanese lost 100,000 troops. 7,400 surrendered. The math was brutal. After the atomic bombs on August 6th and 9th, American aircraft dropped 5 million leaflets over Japan, urging immediate surrender. In total, 347 million leaflets fell on Japan in 1945 alone. The Bushido Code, the cultural imperative that death was preferable to the shame of surrender, had rendered Western psychological operations almost useless. The lesson would haunt American planners in future Asian wars. When North Korea invaded on June 25, 1950, the United States and United Nations forces immediately began dropping leaflets. 2 million fell by July, promising amnesty and humane treatment. The North Korean People's Army had been trained by Soviets and Chinese, but they weren't as ideologically hardened as the Japanese. On September 15th, during the Incheon amphibious landing, American loudspeaker teams broadcast surrender instructions as Marines stormed ashore. 1,500 North Koreans surrendered in the first wave. Total enemy losses at Incheon reached 13,000. The Chinese entered the war in October, sending human wave attacks against UN positions. In spring 1951, at Heartbreak Ridge, the 8th Army dropped 20 million leaflets on Chinese positions. The messages exploited the fact that many Chinese soldiers were peasant conscripts who didn't want to be there. By the armistice on July 27, 1953, UN forces had dropped 2.5 billion leaflets, 2.5 billion pieces of paper floating over the Korean peninsula. They credited the campaign with over 200,000 enemy surrenders out of a peak communist force of 1.2 million. The effectiveness rate was higher than in any previous conflict. Human. Wave tactics made Chinese and North Korean troops especially vulnerable to demoralization. When you're ordered to charge into machine gun fire with minimal support, a leaflet promising hot food and safety becomes very appealing. Korea proved that psychological operations could work in Asia if the enemy's morale was already fragile. Vietnam started quietly. On November 1st, 1955, after the Geneva Accords split the country, American and South Vietnamese forces began dropping leaflets on Viet Minh holdouts. 500,000 by 1960. The messages urged reconciliation, warned against communist tyranny. Then came Edward Lansdale. Lansdale had run covert operations in the Philippines and understood psychological warfare's dark potential. In Saigon during the 50s, he created black propaganda. Fake Viet Cong radio stations that broadcast surrender orders, confusing enemy units. Forged pamphlets that sent Viet Cong soldiers to the wrong locations, sometimes causing friendly fire incidents. Lansdale's operations fooled an estimated 10% of Viet Cong units at various points. When Operation Rolling Thunder began in March 1965, B-52s dropped 1 million leaflets per week over North Vietnam. The Chio Hoi program, Vietnamese for open arms, offered amnesty to defectors. Between 1963 and the program's end, 47,000 Viet Cong walked into government centers carrying leaflets. One defector later said the loudspeakers promised family reunions, and he couldn't resist. During the Tet Offensive on January 31st, 1968, as Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces attacked across South Vietnam, American and South Vietnamese forces dropped 50 million leaflets countering enemy morale. 45,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese died in the offensive. By the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, the United States had dropped 25 billion leaflets over Vietnam. 25 billion. 10,000 hours of loudspeaker broadcasts. The largest psychological operation in history. And it failed to prevent defeat. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese were fighting for their homeland with an ideology that made them resistant to promises of material comfort. Sergeant Alfredo Gonzalez, a Marine loudspeaker operator, received a posthumous Medal of Honor after being killed during Tet at age 21. His loudspeaker was still broadcasting when they found his body. Operation Desert Storm began on January 17, 1991. On the first night, coalition aircraft dropped 29 million leaflets over Kuwait and Iraq. The messages warned Iraqi civilians to evacuate military targets. Saddam Hussein's army numbered 500,000 troops against a coalition force of 670,000. But the coalition had precision weapons and a psychological operations task force that understood modern warfare. February 24th, as the ground war kicked off, loudspeaker teams accompanied armor units. At the Battle of 73 Easting, American tanks blasted AC/DC and Metallica from speakers alongside Arabic surrender instructions. The combination of overwhelming firepower and psychological pressure shattered Iraqi units. 87,000 Iraqi soldiers surrendered. In some sectors, prisoners of war outnumbered the troops guarding them. One Iraqi soldier later testified that leaflets had instructed them to bury white flags in the sand, then dig them up when coalition forces approached. He did exactly that. The leaflets also warned of precision strikes, and when bombs hit exactly where the leaflets said they would, Iraqi morale collapsed. The campaign caused an estimated 20% desertion rate before the ground war even started. Psychological operations had been integrated with shock and awe doctrine for the first time. The Gulf War became the textbook example of PSYOPs, done right. Precise, coordinated, culturally informed, and backed by overwhelming military force. The Iraq War in 2003 built on those lessons, but added a darker element. On March 20th, as the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force advanced toward Baghdad, they dropped 30 million leaflets on Saddam's 400,000 troops. The messages claimed Saddam had fled, that resistance was pointless, that soldiers should go home to their families. Britain's MI6 ran an operation called Mass Appeal, planting stories about weapons of mass destruction in international media before the invasion. The operation was designed to prepare global public opinion and demoralize Iraqi leadership. Whether it crossed ethical lines remains debated. On April 9th, when the statue of Saddam fell in Baghdad, leaflets claimed he had abandoned the country. Total leaflets reached 70 million. The Iraqi army dissolved rapidly. Some units surrendered. Others melted into the population, taking their weapons with them. The psychological operations contributed to the quick conventional victory, but also created a power vacuum that fueled the insurgency. For the first time, email and SMS campaigns supplemented leaflets. Coalition forces sent text messages to Iraqi officers' phones, urging them not to fight. The digital age had arrived, but the core principles remained the same: demoralize, confuse, offer a way out. Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan began on October 7, 2001. 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta dropped 17 million leaflets by December, targeting 45,000 Taliban fighters. The messages were carefully crafted to respect Islamic culture. Leaflets featured Quranic verses and testimonials from tribal elders condemning the Taliban's interpretation of Islam. In spring 2002, during Operation Anaconda in the Shah-e-Khat Valley, loudspeakers induced 100 al-Qaeda fighters to surrender. American losses totaled 8 killed. By 2011, during the final surge in Kandahar province, total leaflets dropped over Afghanistan reached 200 million. The campaign lasted 20 years, the longest psychological operation in American history. The results were mixed. Taliban leadership, ideologically committed and often illiterate, largely ignored the leaflets. Rank-and-file fighters, especially foreign jihadists who had no stake in Afghanistan's future, occasionally defected. But the Taliban's decentralized structure and deep cultural roots made them resistant to the kind of mass demoralization that worked in the Gulf. Cultural adaptation helped. Leaflets that might have worked in Iraq fell flat in Pashtun villages, where loyalty to tribe outweighed everything else. Some facts got buried by history. During World War I, British propaganda spread atrocity stories about Germans, including claims that they crucified Canadian soldiers. After the war, investigators debunked most of these stories. The revelations caused a backlash that made the public distrust all propaganda for a generation. In World War II, American leaflets over Japan used the wrong paper weight. 50% drifted off target, landing in the ocean or empty countryside. In Vietnam, Edward Lansdale's forged Viet Cong pamphlets sometimes sent troops to coordinates where American artillery was already ranged, causing massacres that looked like Viet Cong incompetence. Paul Linebarger, who wrote under the science fiction pen name Cordwainer Smith, served as an OSS psychological operations chief. His 1948 book, Psychological Warfare, remains a classic text. He died in 1966. Herbert Sobel, the officer who trained Easy Company and oversaw early Normandy leaflet drops, blinded himself in 1970 and died in 1987. The effectiveness debate never ended. Surrenders almost always coincided with military defeats. Separating causation from correlation proved impossible. Was it the leaflet that made a German surrender at the Somme, or was it the fact that his entire unit had been obliterated by artillery? Analysts calculated return on investment. When psychological operations worked, they were the most cost-effective weapon in the arsenal. But cultural factors determined outcomes more than volume. Vietnam's 25 billion leaflets failed. The Gulf's 29 million succeeded. The difference wasn't the paper. It was understanding who you were talking to. The legacy runs deeper than most realize. after the Gulf War, the U.S. Army made PSYOP units permanent. Field Manual 305-301 became required reading at West Point. In London, a plaque marks Wellington House, where Masterman gathered those 25 authors in 1914. At Mamayev Kurgan in Stalingrad, a replica loudspeaker stands as a memorial. The U.S. Army PSYOP Museum at Fort Bragg displays artifacts spanning from 18 leaflets to Iraq, cassette tapes to digital campaign screenshots. Paul Linebarger's book is still assigned to military students. The cultural impact spread beyond war. Films like The Interview in 2014 parodied leaflet campaigns. Video games like Call of Duty. Black Ops included Vietnam loudspeaker missions. The techniques developed at Wellington House evolved into modern advertising, political campaigns, and social media strategy. Edward Bernays took what he learned from World War I and built an entire industry around manipulating public opinion. The lesson modern militaries learned is brutal in its simplicity. Cultural understanding determines effectiveness more than volume. You can drop 1 billion leaflets, but if you don't understand what motivates your enemy, you're just littering. The Gulf War worked because planners knew Iraqi conscripts were demoralized and wanted to go home. Vietnam failed because American PSYOPs officers didn't understand that many Vietnamese saw them as foreign invaders, not liberators. Social media replaced leaflets, but the core principles from that September day in 1914 still apply. Find what your enemy fears. Find what they want. Offer them a path that seems better than fighting. From 7 million leaflets in World War I to 25 billion in Vietnam to infinite digital messages today, mind warfare evolved but never disappeared. Charles Masterman's experiment at Wellington House proved that words, deployed correctly, could end wars. Deployed incorrectly, they were just expensive confetti falling on people determined to keep fighting.